On April 22nd, 1970, a seed was planted, the first Earth Day. From that day has sprouted 50 years of celebrations and, more importantly, a movement to protect and sustain the Earth. And yet, when we are talking about the Earth, 50 years is but a speck of time. Recently, I have been reading the 2019 Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Overstory by Robert Powers. The opening chapters each tell the story of one family, then the stories merge into a narrative about a group of activists fighting to save ancient trees and forests. In the first chapter, Jorgen Hoel, a young man in love, proposes beneath the blossoms of a chestnut tree in 19th century New York City. Tucking a handful of nuts into his pocket, Hoel then plants them in his Iowa homestead a few years later. One of these trees grows into its full maturity, spawning a multi-generational project of taking a picture of the tree on the 21st day of every month. The decades pass and hundreds of photos pile up into a flip book. As the great-great-grandson of Jorgen Hoel holds the photos in his hands, Powers writes, "It's his birthright, the Hoel emblem. No other family in the county had a tree like the Hoel tree, and no other family in Iowa could match the multi-generational photo project for pure weirdness." And yet, the adults seemed sworn never to say where the project was going. Neither his grandparents nor his father could explain to him the point of the thick flip book. His grandfather said, "I promised my father and he promised his." But another time from the same man makes you think different about things, doesn't it? It did. Life from the point of view of an old tree can make you think different about things. Living as we are in a moment of coronavirus, we too are thinking differently about many things. And if, in fact, we are able to stop and think, we are still so deep in the moments of crisis as the curve in Massachusetts continues to rise, the date of the predicted crest shifting from one day to the next. Lately, the little disclaimer, "subject to change," no longer feels like a just-in-case possibility, but rather like the repeating baseline beneath every day. Such shifting circumstances reminds me of the infamous adage, "Nothing is certain except for death and taxes." And yet, we also live within rhythms of nature that do bring a kind of certainty. The sun rises and sets on another day. The moon waxes and wanes. Gravity holds. Seasons flow from one to the next. We wait for the springtime return of songbirds. We revel in summer's verdant growth. The haunts of northern geese alert us to the rising chill in the air. Ice and snow will soon follow. And yet here too is change. We cannot be certain about weather patterns. Will this winter be milder or fiercer than normal? Once trusted patterns weaken as so-called 100-year-old storms appear one after the other. Yes, the weather has always had variation and change, but these new uncertainties were predicted. They reflect the decades-long work of noticing the new patterns of the human impact, the rising carbon. The prediction of a changing environment was present on that first Earth Day 50 years ago. In a similar way, the experts paying attention predicted the arrival of a global pandemic. But who was really listening beyond the experts? Who among us expected this? As New Englanders, we like to think we're good at preparing for crises. We've lived through nor'easters and power outages that lasted for days. We know the drill. Stock up on food and water, by puzzles, it seems this would be just like that, right? And now we know it is so much more than that. Tomorrow should have been the Boston Marathon, but the date was changed to September. And 124 years, only once before was the race impacted, in 1918. At the end of World War I and the rise of the Spanish flu, the marathon shifted to a relay race. Tomorrow, the beloved race once again falls prey to a virus. Big changes can begin from the smallest of sources. In the early 20th century, another small source was bringing big change. At the start of that century, millions of American chestnuts still covered the eastern seaboard. 25% of the tree cover in the Appalachian Mountains were said to be chestnuts. These massive trees with their straight trunks and abundant nuts were a fundamental part of the US economy. But fungal spores bearing deadly disease had already begun to spread. Soon, all but a handful of trees would be gone. Even the forests in the mountains are subject to change. Nonetheless, is all change bad? When the organizers of the first Earth Day conceived of an annual event dedicated to the Earth, they changed not only how we mark April 22nd, but also how society began to conceive of its relationship to the Earth. And recognizing the very mutability of ecosystems, the environmental movement called for us to pay attention to the kinds of changes we were effecting. Even now, in an effort to promote a more sustainable flourishing of life on Earth, we are called to make changes in our systems and in our choices. So change is not simply bad or good. Change simply is. Earlier, you heard an adaptation of the words of James Baldwin, who writes, "For nothing is fixed. Forever and forever and forever, it is not fixed. The earth is always shifting. The light is always changing. The sea does not cease to grind down rock. Generations do not cease to be born, and we are responsible to them because we are the only witnesses they have." We are witnesses today to an experience that will shape generations. We do not yet know the impact upon our children, youth, and young adults learning from home. Nor do we know the impact upon the economy, all the unemployed adults, all the retirees with diminished savings. What we do know is that, like sea grinding down rock, these days of quarantine and social distancing are leaving their mark. Some days the impact feels entirely manageable to me, an extended break as if it were from a snowstorm. And other days, I find myself laughing at some clever coronavirus parody, only to start crying. The poignancy of some newly realized loss emerging in my tears. Even as we change our routines and expectations to fit this new reality, we are still within the crisis. This way of being is not normal. This too will change, for nothing is fixed. It is hard to not predict. It is hard to not be able to predict when it will change or how. It is hard to not be able to plan for summer or even fall with certainty. No number of stashed paper towel rolls or completed puzzles will make up for how hard it is to wait and to not know the pace or direction of change. Which is why I like spending time with trees. Trees help me to think different about things. As you may know, today, April 19, is the day patriots battled the English and conquered in Lexington, earlier you might have heard during the prayer, we had fife and drums show up unexpectedly outside celebrating. And on a typical year, a group of local reenactors would have gathered below our tolling bell at 3 a.m. After calling a muster of troops, they would shoot a volley of muskets here and at the Herd House before heading north to join the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Actually, they stopped for donuts between Wayland and Concord, but that's understandable at 4 in the morning. At the time of that battle, many of the wooded spaces around us would have been clear-cut for farmland. There are exceptions, of course, like the 250-year-old oak standing across the street from where I am. This tree likely witnessed General Knox bringing his cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to fight the British in Boston. Such big trees humble me as living reminders of time passing, like the fictional Hole tree in the Overstory. These old trees are witnesses to the human generations that come and go beneath their canopies. Just as we are witnesses to the remnant of stone walls that once marked fields and rest quietly now in regrown forests. We are part of the relay race of human generations leaving their mark on the world. Earth Day asks us to consider, what kind of mark will we leave upon this earth? Perhaps like no Earth Day before, we are keenly aware of the interconnected web of life and of disease. We are biological creatures whose lives intersect with our environment. And we are social creatures whose socioeconomic systems have unjustly left the poor and people of color disproportionately vulnerable to economic hardship, severe illness, and even death. Indeed, some have argued that practices of environmental racism have contributed to the underlying conditions in communities of color that are now manifesting in higher death rates from the coronavirus. Even in the midst of a health crisis, we see how our environmental choices impact the just flourishing of life. For many of us living as we do in leafy suburbs, we live among the trees, which are beginning to reawaken to spring. I recently read a funny meme that suggested if we're missing hugs in this era of social distancing, perhaps we could become a tree hugger instead. Perhaps hugging a tree, or at least sitting beneath it and gazing upon it, could be a source to sustain us. Both deeply rooted and flexible enough to sway in the changing wind. Trees provide a model of how to live season after season in times of recurring change. Perhaps paying attention to trees or another aspect of nature might just help us think differently about things. As we approach the 50th Earth Day celebration this Wednesday, my hope is that we continue to think differently about the patterns of our lives and our society. And as we do so, may we draw deep upon the boundless love in our lives as we imagine ways to work together to help life justly flourish for all. So may it be. Amen.